For everyone, without exception in this vast world, it is usually the parents who are the closest and most devoted friends. But who, if not them, will teach us so we'll understand the world around us and show us the right way? Let's not be deceived. Sometimes we do not always understand and accept it. We forget that they are only trying to do this for us, often to the detriment of their own interests and even health. Sometimes it happens that what is considered the norm for most of us, and what we all do not always pay attention to, can only be a dream that will never come true. A dream of parents and a home, such a dream that was in the mind of one little girl named Wedge from the United States. This story began many years ago on a street, probably the most unfortunate area of Kansas City, where in the early 20s did not rule the peace and order, but rather violence, street gangs, and brutality. And as it happens, a little girl named Clint, along with her 2 brothers and her mother, were unlucky enough to live in this particular creepy neighborhood. Not that her mother was a very bad woman, but because of her life problems, she was often on the verge of a breakdown. At the same time, and it happened that she could not be home for several days, and the local social services family passed as troubled. 9-year-old Clinton was often left without basic food, and as it happened, it was her and had to take care of 2 younger brothers who were hungry and looked at her older sister as an angel. And since her mother was never around, the only way to keep from starving to feed her brothers was to steal. A 9-year-old girl had to commit the first crime of her life. One day she walked into a gas station convenience store and, after taking some food, walked out without paying for it. Of course, the young criminal was tormented by guilt, but hunger makes her do other things too. As you would expect, the police quickly found out about the little thief. And by the way, that's what changed her whole life. But first things first. Even despite everything that surrounded the little Clint, literally at every step, she was not discouraged and believed that one day there will come the day that will not only give her hope, but also turn her whole life. Well, to occupy herself while she waited for a miracle, she tried to spend time in her own world, where there were no dirty streets and no violence. Every day she would sit by the window and just look at the world around her and the people outside the window. And it just so happened that every day, by some unknowing coincidence, people would pass by her house. At least, that's what she thought. A man passed by, and sometimes even passed by. As Klein herself told me later, I waited every day to see him. He was in a handsome uniform, and his gait and whole appearance froze me. He was always looking out our window, as if he knew I would be there waiting for him. Anyway, one day I couldn't help myself and just waved at him. I was surprised when he smiled and waved back. I remember hiding behind the window. I didn't even think he noticed me. But as it turned out, that same man in the handsome uniform outside the window was a mascot named Jeff. Even after the first incident, as the theft of little Klein became known to him, he had one goal in mind, and that was to keep an eye on the family home. Jeff Collin was a patrolman who worked in the area, and after learning the little girl's story and gathering information about the dysfunctional family, he decided that every time he spent his next watch, he would be a little closer to that house in order to know that they were doing okay. But there was more to come. Already from that day on, their daily greeting had become something of a ritual. Clint didn't even know the policeman's name, but every day they still continued to say hello through the window, and the girl greeted him cheerfully. A few days later, there was a knock on her door. There was the same policeman friend on the doorstep, smiling and saying he just wanted to talk. I remember him saying to me at the time, "Hi stranger, who keeps waving at me through the window. I just want you to know, if ever you or your brothers need help, or maybe something scares you, you can always call me. Don't be afraid of anything. I'll be there every day." I stood there and just stared at him with my mouth open. Klein told me later with a smile. Given the fact that my mother wasn't always around, the only person she could trust was the officer. When we were scared at home, I always told my brothers that he would protect us, and it always helped. That's how the friendship between the girl and the policeman began, which would later turn her whole life upside down. One very ordinary day, still passing by the house, Jeff looked at the window and to his surprise, found no Wedge there. He thought it strange that she did not come out to greet him, and that alarmed him. After all, he was used to seeing the little girl waving and smiling at him cheerfully every morning. Without thinking, he went to the door of her house and knocked, but no one opened it for him. He tried to call out to her, but there was also silence in response. Then he cracked the thin door and, entering the house, he could not believe his eyes. Wedge was lying on the floor, and seeing her new friend, she whispered that it was very difficult for her to breathe. Beside her were crying two younger brothers who did not know what to do. At the same moment, the officer of the law took the baby in his arms, put her brothers in the backseat of the car and rushed to the hospital. As the doctors would later say, it was the only thing that saved her. Wedge was so bad that she began to lose consciousness. She was given a disappointing diagnosis, acute malnutrition. At the hospital, the little girl was taken by her mother, and a policeman was by her side the entire time, after which he had a serious conversation with her grieving parents. But apparently, he knew that nothing would come of it. So after that day, he started visiting Klein and her brothers, bringing them some food. And so it went on day after day. He always told me I had to be, maybe he thought I was too young to understand. But I absorbed his every word like a sponge and knew I would do exactly as he said. He became the only father I could trust. But friendship, as it were, and one day it's a beautiful story, friendship interrupted. Still, getting ahead of myself, I will say interrupted, but not ended. Soon after the incident, Klein and her brothers were moved permanently out of this town by their mother. And Jeff didn't know what had happened to the little Wedge or how her fate had turned out. In spite of this, he still did his direct duties and did them well. And after 20 years, he retired to a well-deserved retirement. He only sometimes remembered that little girl who many years ago waved to him from the window. And all the time he wondered how her fate had turned out strong. Told me never to give up. But just as he was about to leave the service, Jennifer Jones, an investigator from Kansas City, approached him and said she had important news for him, but that he had to go to a meeting. Jeff was confused, but nevertheless complied with his colleague's request. And when he arrived at the appointed place, he did not immediately believe what was happening. Before him stood a beautiful young girl, full of strength and energy. She was studying confidence. But all this was exactly until she saw Jeff, after which she walked up to him and embraced him. It was at that moment that he realized who was really standing in front of him. But what he found out a little later made the experienced policeman even cry. As it turned out, Klein had been trying to find her savior for a long time. But since it had been 20 years since then, she didn't know his name or whether he was now serving or not. She tried to find him on social media and even grew all the open police officer databases, but she was never able to find anything. And perhaps that's how the story phase would have ended. But one day she received an email from investigator Jennifer Jones indicating that she probably knew who she was talking about. In fact, Jennifer arranged for them to meet, but the climax of the whole story was yet to come. As it turned out, the girl remembered all her life the words the guardian angel had spoken to her. Yes, that's what she called her policeman. She remembered him telling her to never give up. And she remembered that he had saved her life. And that's why she decided that the cycle of kindness in this world must never stop. She was so inspired with his actions that many years later, she became a police officer herself in the city of Houston. And now that she knew his name, she added another reminder of why she protects the city streets and its residents. By making herself a name bracelet with his name and the words "Real Hero," Wedge, a young mother of two wonderful children who are now living and enjoying life. And it's all thanks to a stranger. She was always waving out the window. Kansas City police shared this touching story. And soon other people began writing about how Jeff Holden had done a lot of good in their lives as well. Even the simplest acts of kindness that he did on a daily basis, which he thought of as something mundane, turned out to actually change the lives of many people for the better, and probably change the world as a whole. Even our most basic actions or our words can change the lives of dozens of people, even if we don't realize it. Write your thoughts on this amazing 20-year story, and of course, about the deed of a policeman named Jeff. But that's probably it for today. If you liked the video, and see you soon.